We're also identifying shocking levels of incompetence and probable fraud in the Social Security program for our seniors, and that our seniors and people that we love rely on.
At 2:11 a.m., a routine federal monitoring system flagged a transaction that should have passed unnoticed. It wasn't large. It wasn't unusual. And under normal conditions, it would have disappeared into the system like millions of other automated transfers processed every single day. But this transaction was flagged for one reason. Its movement pattern matched a sequence investigators had archived nearly 18 months earlier. At the time, that earlier sequence had triggered concern inside multiple federal oversight divisions. Analysts believed they were looking at the early stages of a structured laundering corridor hidden inside legitimate financial infrastructure. But the investigation stalled. No direct suspects. No confirmed access point. No clear endpoint. Eventually the case was buried. And the pattern disappeared. Until now. Because when analysts reopened the archived logs, the match was not partial. It was exact. Same timing intervals. Same fragmentation structure. Same routing behavior designed to remain below automatic reporting thresholds. But this time, something had changed. The execution was cleaner. More precise. Whoever built the system had refined it. Which meant the operation had never stopped. It had evolved. The case was quietly reopened. No announcements. No public filings. No federal press briefings. Just a small internal task force assigned to review the anomaly before it spread further through the system. At first, investigators focused on the destination of the money. But that approach failed almost immediately. The funds never stayed in one place long enough to trace. Instead, analysts shifted focus. Not on where the money ended. But on how it moved. And that changed everything. Because this system was not built around storage. It was built around flow. Continuous movement. Accounts opening and closing. Transfers fragmenting and reforming. Digital identities appearing for hours before disappearing again. Everything kept moving. Always rotating. Always shifting. Always staying ahead of detection. Within days, investigators uncovered a corridor of connected shell entities tied to consulting firms, administrative contractors, and third-party processing companies spread across multiple states. Individually, each company appeared legitimate. Tax filings matched. Licenses were active. Federal registrations were clean. But together, they formed something far more dangerous. A hidden financial infrastructure operating quietly beneath existing government systems. And every layer of that infrastructure pointed toward one central hub. Texas. Weeks passed. The transfers continued. Small amounts. Consistent patterns. Perfect timing. Every transaction structured carefully below reporting thresholds. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger immediate intervention. But collectively, the scale became impossible to ignore. Then investigators noticed something unexpected. A name. At first it looked insignificant. Just another administrative contractor attached to a routine authorization file. But when analysts cross-referenced archived records, the same name appeared again. And again. Inside approval chains. Internal access logs. Verification overrides. System-level authorizations. That was the moment the investigation paused. Because repetition at that level is never accidental. It is structural. The individual was not linked directly to the transfers. He was linked to the systems approving them. And those systems led directly into a hidden layer of government infrastructure. At that point, federal investigators realized this was no longer a case about isolated financial fraud. This was system-level manipulation. Someone with authorized internal access was quietly controlling the movement of billions. And if they acted too early, the entire structure could disappear overnight. So they waited. They watched. And they kept building the pattern. By month 6, investigators noticed something else changing inside the system. Approval times had dropped dramatically. Claims that once required weeks of verification were suddenly being processed within 48 hours. In some regions, approvals were happening in less than 12. Audit logs showed unexplained gaps. Verification checkpoints disappeared entirely. On paper, it looked like efficiency. Modernization. Administrative improvement. But when analysts overlaid approval spikes against financial routing activity, the alignment was nearly perfect. Every increase in approvals matched an increase in structured transfers. Every surge in beneficiary activity matched another wave of financial movement. That was when investigators reached a conclusion they could no longer ignore. This network was not operating outside the system. It was operating inside it. Using legitimate infrastructure to conceal illegitimate flow. And that made it far more dangerous than anyone initially believed. Because systems built to protect the public had been quietly converted into tools for extraction. By month 9, the scale began expanding rapidly. Federal analysts identified abnormal beneficiary growth across 11 states. Some regions showed increases exceeding 18% despite no measurable population change. Other areas reported thousands of new beneficiaries appearing within a single fiscal cycle. The numbers made no sense. But the automation systems approved them anyway. Quietly. Efficiently. Without resistance. Investigators now estimate the hidden infrastructure redirected nearly $6.2 billion over multiple years. Funds originally intended for vulnerable Americans. Retirees. Disabled individuals. Survivors receiving federal support. Instead, enormous portions of that money were quietly rerouted into hidden financial corridors operating beneath the surface of legitimate systems. And the deeper analysts went, the worse it became. Thousands of linked identity profiles appeared across interconnected databases. Duplicate addresses. Repeated biometric markers. Inactive identities suddenly reactivated. Payments continuing long after official death records had been entered into the system. This was no longer administrative failure. This was design. The system had been engineered to scale itself. And someone inside was protecting it. By month 11, federal surveillance intensified. Still no arrests. Still no public awareness. Investigators feared that one wrong move could collapse the entire operation before they identified the core structure behind it. Encrypted communications were monitored. Internal network traffic was tracked overnight. Analysts studied server behavior during low. Monthly transfer surges. Quarterly identity resets. Every stage automated with near-perfect timing. Then investigators found the central coordination hub. Buried inside a secured administrative processing complex outside Dallas, Texas. Officially, the facility handled back-end authorization support for regional processing systems. But internal activity logs told a different story. Server activity peaked between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. every morning. Access credentials rotated continuously. Authorization patterns bypassed normal oversight protocols. Large volumes of encrypted traffic moved through isolated internal channels never intended for public-facing operations. That was when federal command approved intervention. Not as a standard raid. But as a coordinated federal operation. Because by now, investigators understood something critical. The structure was layered. And removing one piece would not stop the system. At 4:37 a.m., movement began. No sirens. No media alerts. No public warning. Just black federal vehicles moving silently through rain-covered streets outside the secured facility. Within minutes, tactical teams surrounded the complex. Power isolation units secured the perimeter. Cyber response teams prepared internal containment systems. Federal agents waited for final authorization. Then the command came through. Move. The breach happened fast. Steel entry tools shattered reinforced glass doors. Agents flooded the lobby. Hallways were secured immediately. Internal communications cut. Network access isolated. Employees inside the building were detained and separated before any emergency deletion protocols could activate. Inside the lower levels of the facility, investigators found the real operation. Rows of server racks glowing blue in the darkness. Massive digital displays showing live identity routing activity. Automated approval dashboards still processing transactions in real time during the raid itself. The system was still active. Federal cyber teams immediately began imaging the servers before shutdown procedures could erase the infrastructure. And what they found shocked investigators. Wall-sized databases containing thousands of linked identity profiles. Connected biometric systems. Layered authorization maps. Automated verification bypass structures. Entire approval chains engineered to move identities through the system without triggering review. But the financial movement was even worse. Transaction routing software was actively fragmenting transfers into smaller amounts before redistributing them through shell contractors across multiple states. Then investigators uncovered another layer. The redirected funds were not simply disappearing. Portions were being routed into external criminal operations already under federal surveillance. Drug distribution corridors. Interstate trafficking systems. Money laundering channels tied to organized criminal networks. The government infrastructure itself had become part of a larger financial ecosystem. And someone had spent years making sure nobody noticed. By 6:12 a.m., the operation expanded nationally. Federal warrants activated simultaneously across multiple states. Additional facilities were raided. Accounts frozen. Transfers halted. Digital routing systems disconnected. For the first time in years, the infrastructure stopped moving. And that was when investigators made the discovery that changed the entire case. Inside one secured server cluster was a secondary access registry. Not transaction operators. Not financial coordinators. Protection layers. Individuals connected not to running the system, but to shielding it from oversight. Internal reviewers. Authorization supervisors. Compliance contacts. People positioned specifically to prevent investigations from moving too close to the core infrastructure. The network had not survived because it was hidden. It survived because it was protected internally. By mid-morning, dozens of individuals were already in federal custody. Hundreds of linked financial accounts had been frozen. Millions in assets seized. Emergency audits launched across multiple federal systems. But investigators knew the deeper damage would take far longer to understand. Because this operation had not bypassed the system. It had embedded itself inside it. And as analysts reviewed the original transaction that triggered everything, the one flagged at exactly 2:11 a.m., they discovered something unexpected. It was not the largest transaction. It was not the most sophisticated. It was simply the first one that failed to execute perfectly. A timing mismatch. Just a few seconds outside the established routing window. Enough for the monitoring system to notice. Enough to expose the pattern. Enough to unravel a hidden infrastructure worth billions. Which meant something deeply disturbing. For years, the system had worked exactly as designed. And the only reason investigators ever discovered it was because somewhere inside that structure, someone made a mistake. And that raised one final question.